She saved a dying stranger in a canyon cave, set his broken bones with her bare hands, stayed 3 nights in the dark keeping him alive. He told her his name was Jonah. He told her he was nobody. But when the rescue riders came and called him by his real name, she realized the man she had been saving was the same man who had watched her step off that train, watched her wait alone on that platform and never said a word. He was the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry, and he had been lying beneath her hands the entire time. This is their story. She stepped off the train into nothing. No husband waiting, no welcoming face, no hand reaching for her bag. Just an empty platform, the cold autumn wind sweeping dead leaves across weathered boards, in the Rocky Mountain. And the Rocky Mountains rising behind the town like a wall between her old life and whatever came next. The letter had promised a home. The letter had promised a partner. The letter, it seemed, had lied. Rosalie Whitfield stood alone on the platform at Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, watching the last passenger disappear around the corner of the station house. The train behind her hissed and groaned, its iron lungs exhausted from 6 days of hauling souls across the continent. 6 days she had spent on hard wooden seats, clutching her carpet bag to her chest like a shield against every whisper, every sidelong glance, every pitying shake of a proper woman's head. Mail-order bride, they murmured behind their fans. Poor, foolish girl. Rose had heard every word. She had pretended not to. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let me tell you about Rosalie Whitfield and how she ended up standing on that platform with $3.42 to her name and a heart full of desperate hope. She was 23 years old, born and raised in Philadelphia to parents who were good but not lucky. Her father, Edmund Whitfield, had been a small print shop owner, a decent man with a weak chest and strong principles, who worked himself to exhaustion every winter and spent every summer coughing into handkerchiefs he tried to hide from his daughter. He died when Rose was 14. The consumption took him on a Tuesday morning in November, and by Wednesday the creditors had already come knocking. Her mother, Margaret, was a different kind of woman entirely. Not a doctor, never claimed to be. But she knew things that doctors didn't or wouldn't. She knew which plants healed and which ones killed. She knew that yarrow stopped bleeding when pressed into a wound. She knew that willow bark chewed or brewed into tea could break a fever that would otherwise break a man. She knew how to set a bone, how to stitch vows, how to brew a tincture that could ease the pain of childbirth or the ache of a broken heart. Margaret Whitfield had taught Rose everything. Starting when the girl was 7 years old, barely tall enough to reach the drying herbs that hung from the kitchen ceiling, Margaret had placed seeds in her daughter's hands and said the words that Rose would carry for the rest of her life. Every plant has a purpose, Rose. Every person has a story worth knowing. Margaret died in the winter of 1875. Pneumonia. She caught it nursing a neighbor's sick child during an outbreak that swept through their street like a cold wind through an open door. By the time Rose realized her mother was ill, truly ill, and began mixing the remedies she had been taught, it was too late. Margaret died in Rose's arms on a January morning, the light thin and gray through the frost-covered window, and her last words were a command, not a comfort. Use what I taught you, my darling. Don't let it go to waste. After that, Rose went to live with her uncle. Harold Whitfield was her father's younger brother, a man who ran a dry goods store on Chestnut Street, and who took Rose in not because he wanted to, but because people would have talked if he hadn't. His wife Edith was a woman of sharp elbows and sharper opinions, and she made certain that Rose understood every single day that the food she ate was charity, the bed she slept in was a favor, and the roof over her head was an act of Christian generosity that could be withdrawn at any moment. 3 years Rose lived in that house. 3 years of keeping house cooking meals, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, keeping the store's ledger books in her neat, careful hand. 3 years without a penny of wages, without a word of thanks, without a moment in which she felt like anything other than a burden someone had been too polite to refuse. She became invisible. Small, quiet. She wore gray dresses and pinned her hair tight and kept her eyes down when she spoke. It was a survival strategy. The less space she occupied, the less anyone complained. And then one August afternoon, while sorting inventory in the back of Harold's store, Rose found the advertisement. It was printed in a newspaper that had been used to wrap a shipment of tin cups already weeks old, creased and stained. But the words were clear. Wanted, a wife of good character and strong constitution. Mountain rancher in Montana Territory seeks a partner for life, not a decoration. Must be willing to work hard, speak honestly, and build something real. Inquire S. Calloway, Copper Ridge, Montana. Build something real. Rose read it twice. Then she tore the advertisement from the page and slipped it into her apron pocket, and that night, by candlelight in her attic room, she wrote her first letter to a man named Silas Calloway. She did not write prettily. She did not craft careful sentences designed to impress. She wrote the truth. She was an orphan. She lived on her uncle's charity. She knew herbs and healing. She could keep a ledger and stretch a dollar and work from dawn until her hands ached. And what she wanted more than anything in the world was to matter, to build something with her own hands, to wake up in the morning and know that what she did that day would make a difference. Silas wrote back 2 weeks later. The handwriting was neat, strong, careful. He described his ranch, the work that needed doing, the mountains that surrounded his land like the walls of a cathedral. He wrote about wanting a partner, not a pretty face to set on a shelf. He wrote with a directness that felt like fresh air after years of her uncle's stuffy parlor. I won't lie to you, Miss Whitfield, he had written in his third letter. Life here is hard. The mountains don't forgive mistakes. But the work is honest, and there is a kind of freedom in it I have never found anywhere else. If you are willing to build something real, something that matters, then I believe we could make a good life together. 3 months of letters, 12 from each side. Rose had read his so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, the ink faintly smudged from her fingers. And in his fifth letter, Silas had written something that cracked open a door inside her chest that she had thought was sealed shut forever. I think you understand loneliness the way I do, not as the absence of people, but as the absence of being truly seen. Come west, Miss Whitfield. Let me see you. So she sold her mother's cameo brooch, the last thing she owned that mattered, and bought a train ticket in a navy blue traveling dress. She sent a telegram with her arrival date and time, and she boarded the train without looking back. Now here she stood, Copper Ridge, end of the line. The town was exactly as depressing as she had feared. One dirt road running between buildings that leaned slightly as if exhausted by the wind that poured down from the mountains. A general store with dusty windows. A saloon that leaked the smell of old beer into the street. A small church with a steeple pointing heavenward like an accusatory finger. And behind everything, rising impossibly high, the Rocky Mountains. Snow on their peaks despite the early autumn warmth below. Mountains turning gold on their lower slopes, blazing like torches against the dark green pine. Rose sat on the bench outside the station house, back straight, hands folded over her bag. A lady even here, even now. Minutes crawled past. The train pulled away in a cloud of black smoke. The platform emptied. A man in a dusty vest climbed into a waiting wagon and disappeared down the main road. Rose sat. The sun moved. The shadows lengthened. Her throat went dry. No one came. When the shadows had crossed the full width of the street, Rose finally allowed herself to face the truth. Silas Calloway was not coming. The realization did not crash over her. It seeped in cold and certain like water through a crack in a foundation. He had changed his mind. Or perhaps he had never meant to come at all. Perhaps she had been nothing but entertainment for lonely evenings on a mountain ranch, and her letters had been passed around the bunkhouse for the hired men to laugh at. The desperate Eastern woman willing to cross a continent for a man she had never met. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth and sharp eyes that missed nothing, poked his head out of the ticket window. You still here, miss? I am waiting for Mr. Calloway. Silas Calloway. Do you know him? Something flickered across the man's face. Recognition, certainly. And something else. Surprise, maybe, or concern. Calloway. Sure, I know the Calloways. Biggest ranch in the territory. 3 brothers, Silas, Ezra, and young Jonah. Though Jonah has been back east for some months now, he squinted at her. What business you got with Silas? Rose's cheeks burned. He is expecting me. That's so. The man, Boone Taggart by name, leaned against the window frame. Well, I ain't seen Silas in days. But Ezra came through yesterday. Said the boss was checking fence lines up on the North Ridge. Big storm 2 days back. Weakened some canyon walls up there. How far is the ranch? 12 miles, give or take. Due west up through the canyon and into the high country. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into a dented tin can. You got a horse numb. Money for the livery. Rose opened her reticule. $3.42 looked back at her, every penny she possessed in the world. Hotel is $5 a night, Boone said, not unkindly. Boarding house might take you, but old Mrs. Pemberton don't accept women traveling alone. Says it ain't proper. Of course not. Rose closed the reticule with numb fingers. $5 a night meant she could not afford even one night. And then what, throw herself on the mercy of strangers? Wire her uncle begging for money, proving every cruel thing he had ever said about her foolishness? No, absolutely not. Is there a path to the ranch? Boone frowned. Road is the long way around. Follows the valley floor. 20 miles, maybe more. Canyon path is shorter cut straight through the mountains, but it ain't easy walking. Rocky, narrow in places, and the mountain weather turns fast this time of year. He studied her worn boots, her travel-stained dress. You planning to walk it, if I have to. Sunsets early this time of year, and when it gets dark up there, it gets cold. Real cold. You won't make it before nightfall. Then I had better start now. Boone opened his mouth as if to argue. Then he seemed to think better of it and shrugged. Canyon path starts just past the livery. Follow it west till you hit the fork where the creek splits. Take the north trail, head toward the tallest peak. That is Callaway Land. Rose nodded once, crisp and businesslike, and as though she made decisions like this every day, as though her heart was not slamming against her ribs hard enough to crack them. Thank you. She picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the town. Spine straight, chin lifted. Behind her, she heard Boone Taggart mutter something that sounded like, "Damn fool girl, gonna freeze to death." But she did not turn around. Past the last building, the land opened up. Scrub brush and red rock gave way to sparse pine forest and a trail that climbed steadily into the mountains. The canyon entrance was exactly where Boone had said it would be. A narrow path cutting between two walls of layered stone that rose hundreds of feet on either side, striped in bands of rust and cream and deep brown, wearing coats of lichen and moss in the places where sunlight never reached. Rose paused at the entrance. The wind was different here, colder, sharper, carrying the smell of pine sap and sheen and wet stone and something wild she could not name. The carpet bag dragged at her shoulder. The sensible thing would have been to turn back, find somewhere to sleep even if it cost her last dollar. Wait until morning, send word to the ranch. But Sensible had never gotten Rose anywhere. Sensible had kept her trapped in her uncle's house, invisible and grateful. Sensible had nearly convinced her not to answer that advertisement in the first place. She had come too far to be sensible now. Rose entered the canyon. The walls rose on either side, blocking the wind, but trapping the afternoon heat close to the ground. Her boots crunched on loose gravel. Water dripped somewhere between the rocks, a sound like a slow clock counting down. The path twisted and turned following the natural curve of the stone. Sometimes it widened into spaces large enough for a wagon. Other times it narrowed until Rose had to turn sideways, her skirt catching on jutting rock, the stone close enough to smell chalky and ancient. Columns of late afternoon sunlight angled through gaps in the canyon walls, turning the dust in the air to gold. A hawk cried somewhere far above, sharp and lonely, its voice bouncing between the cliffs until it sounded like a dozen birds calling at once. Rose walked. The bag grew heavier with every step. Sweat ran down her back. Her water had been finished on the train, and her throat felt lined with dust. But she did not stop. If she stopped, she might not start again. The light began to change, took on that deep amber quality that meant the day was ending. Her shadow stretched long and thin ahead of her, trembling on the uneven ground. She tried not to think about what it would be like to be caught here after dark. Tried not to imagine stumbling over unseen rocks, twisting her ankle, lying here alone. She forced the thoughts away. Left foot, right foot, one step at a time. That was all. That was enough. And then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the scuff of her own boots on stone. A low groan, barely human, drifting from somewhere ahead and bouncing off the canyon walls until it was impossible to tell exactly where it came from. Rose froze. Hello? Her voice echoed back to her, strange and small. Silence, then again. That sound. Weaker this time, but unmistakably human. Someone was hurt. Every instinct Rose possessed screamed at her to turn around. She was alone, unarmed, without help for miles. Whoever was making that sound could be dangerous, could be a trap, could be anything. The groan dissolved into a wet, rattling cough, and something deep inside Rose shifted. Something her mother had planted there years ago in a kitchen that smelled of chamomile and dried lavender, with small, steady hands guiding her daughter's fingers over the leaves of a healing book. You never leave someone in pain, Rose. Never. She moved forward, carpet bag clutched tight, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Around the next bend, the path widened into a small clearing where the canyon walls pulled back, and there, half buried beneath a slide of rock and red earth, was a man. Rose's breath stopped. He was sprawled on his side, one arm pinned beneath a boulder the size of a plow horse. His clothes were torn and filthy dark with what had to be blood. His face was turned toward the ground, hatless dark chestnut hair matted with dust and dirt. And even in this state, even crushed and bleeding and barely moving, Rose could see that this was no ordinary man. He was enormous, shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway, hands the size of dinner plates calloused and scarred across the knuckles. The kind of body built not by vanity, but by years of splitting wood and hauling fence posts and wrestling cattle on mountain slopes. His clothes beneath the blood and dirt were good quality. Thick flannel shirt, heavy denim trousers, handmade leather boots. Whoever this man was, he was not poor. Rose dropped her bag and ran to him, boots skidding on loose stone. Up close, the damage was worse than she had thought. The boulder had him trapped from shoulder to hip. His breathing was shallow, rapid each exhale carrying a thin whistle that meant broken ribs at least. One leg was twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. "Can you hear me?" Rose knelt beside him and touched his shoulder gently. His shirt was soaked through with sweat and blood, the fabric hot against her palm. "I am going to help you." The man's head moved, his eyes opened. Just slits. Gray. Pale gray, like a winter sky just before snow, unfocused with pain. And then those eyes swept across her face and something happened. Something Rose would remember for the rest of her life. A flash of recognition, quick as lightning, gone just as fast, replaced by pain and confusion. But it had been there, she was certain of it. He had looked at her as though he knew her. "Leave." The word came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. "Not safe. I'm not leaving you here." Rose stood and circled the boulder, assessing the situation with the eyes her mother had given her. The eyes of a healer, the eyes that looked at a catastrophe and searched for a solution. The boulder weighed several hundred pounds at least. She could not move it alone. But perhaps she did not need to move all of it. She scanned the clearing. There, Swamo, a length of dead juniper thick as her arm wedged between two rocks. She grabbed it and tested its weight. Solid, heavy enough to serve. She positioned the wood against the boulder at an angle, creating a lever, then found the flattest stone she could carry and placed it near the man's body as a fulcrum. "This is going to hurt." She said it clearly, needing him to understand. "When I lift, you need to pull yourself free. Can you do that?" His eyes opened wider, focused on her with visible effort. Again that flash, that recognition, that strange certainty in his gaze. Then it was gone. "Can't move," he whispered. "You have to try." Rose gripped the lever, braced her feet, took one breath, two, on three. 1, 2, 3. She threw every pound she had onto the wood. The boulder shifted, barely an inch, but it shifted. The man screamed, a raw, tearing sound that bounced off the canyon walls and sent the hawk above wheeling away into the sky. "Pull!" Rose shouted, her muscles shaking the lever, bending under the strain. Now he moved. God alone knew how, but he moved. Those enormous hands clawed at the gravel, dragging his body forward inch by agonizing inch. Rose felt the boulder settle back, missing his body by a margin she did not want to think about. She dropped the lever and fell to her knees beside him, hands shaking so badly she could barely feel them. He was free, bleeding, broken, possibly dying, but free. Up close in the fading light, she could see his face clearly for the first time. Strong features, a hard jaw covered in 2 days of stubble, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, old and faded. High cheekbones weathered by years of mountain sun. He was younger than she had first thought. Perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two older. And despite the blood and the dirt and the agony written across every line of his face, there was something striking about him. Something that went deeper than the strong jaw and the broad shoulders. An intensity in those pale gray eyes, even glazed as they were with shock, that spoke of intelligence and will and something almost dangerous. "You are alive," Rose said more to herself than to him. "You are going to stay that way." She had no idea if that was true, but she said it anyway because saying it made it feel possible, and right now, possibility was all she had. "What is your name?" The word came out slurred, thick with pain. "Jonah. Jonah Calloway." Rose's hand went still on the bandage she was pressing to his shoulder. Calloway. The same name as the man who was supposed to meet her at the station. The man who had written her letters full of promises about partnership and honesty and building something real. The man who had not come. "Are you related to Silas Calloway?" But Jonah Calloway's eyes had rolled back. His body went slack against the ground. Rose checked his pulse. Thready, fast. But there. She sat back on her heels and looked around the empty canyon. The sun was sinking fast, painting the rock walls in shades of amber and dried blood. The temperature was already dropping. Up here in the mountains, autumn nights came hard and cold, nothing like the gentle cooling of a Philadelphia evening. In an hour, it would be dark. In 2, it would be freezing. She could not stay here in the open, but she could not leave him. Rose closed her eyes. She allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of pure, overwhelming panic. 5 seconds in which she was not brave, not determined, not any of the things she needed to be. 5 seconds in which she was just a 23-year-old woman, alone in the wilderness with a dying stranger, and no help for miles in any direction. Then she opened her eyes, stood up, and got to work. First, stop the bleeding. She tore her petticoat into strips, bandaging the worst of his wounds as tightly as she dared. The shoulder was bad, possibly broken. The ribs were certainly cracked. She could hear them shift when he breathed. Second, find shelter. Rose scanned the canyon walls and spotted it about 50 yards back the way she had come. A dark shadow in the rock face that might be a cave or might be nothing. Only one way to find out. She grabbed her carpet bag in one hand and his uninjured arm in the other. Then she began to drag. He was heavy, dead weight, 230 pounds at least, all of it muscle and bones, so. Her back screamed in protest, her arms burned. But Rose gritted her teeth and pulled, inch by inch, foot by foot, leaving a trail in the dust like a plow dragging through dry earth. When she pulled, she could feel just how large this man truly was. His shoulders were nearly as wide as she was tall. Dragging him was like dragging a fallen tree. The shadow in the rock was a cave, shallow but deep enough to shelter them from the wind. And inside, miracle of miracles, she found the remains of an old campfire, blackened stones arranged in a ring, charred wood. Someone had stayed here before. Rose dragged Jonah inside and collapsed against the cave wall, chest heaving, arms trembling, the world tilting slightly at its edges. She gave herself 60 seconds to recover. Then she stood up and went looking for firewood. The canyon provided dried juniper branches, tufts of dead sage, even a few pieces of what looked like lumber from an old wagon. Rose gathered it all with numb efficiency, her mind carefully, deliberately blank. If she let herself think about what she was doing, about how insane this all was, she would come apart like wet paper. So she did not think. She only moved. The fire took 3 attempts to light. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the matches. But finally, blessedly, a flame caught. It spread across the kindling and filled the cave with flickering orange warmth, pushing back the darkness and the cold and the terrible sense of being swallowed by something vast and indifferent. Rose turned to Jonah. In the firelight, she could see him properly now, younger than she had thought at first, close to her own age or a few years older. His face was lean and sun-weathered, all hard planes and strong angles, the kind of face shaped by years of work in open country. His hands, resting slack against the stone floor, were enormous, the fingers thick and calloused, the knuckles scarred from 100 small injuries that came with a life lived on horseback and in timber. Whoever he was, wherever he came from, this was a man who had earned every line on his face. Rose opened her carpet bag and took inventory. One change of clothes, her mother's medical journal pages filled with careful drawings of plants and handwritten recipes for poultices and tinctures, a sewing kit, a hairbrush, 3 books, and tucked into the very bottom, wrapped in cloth like a secret, a small packet of dried herbs she had brought almost without thinking. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, comfrey for broken bones. "Thank you," Mama Rose whispered. She checked his pulse again. Still there, still fighting. She brushed the hair from his forehead, the way her mother used to do when Rose was small and feverish, and spoke to him even though she knew he could not hear. "My name is Rose," she said softly. "Just Rose. You are going to be all right." She found a dented tin cup among the remains of the old campfire and carried it to the canyon seep she had noticed on her way in. The water trickled from between 2 rocks painfully slow. 10 minutes to fill the cup halfway. 10 minutes crouching in the cold mountain dark while her mind ran through everything her mother had taught her about wounds, about fever, about keeping a man alive when everything around you was trying to kill him. She boiled the water over the fire, ground willow bark between 2 flat stones until it was a coarse powder, mixed it with the water and a pinch of yarrow, creating a bitter-smelling tea that her mother would have recognized. The hard part was getting Jonah to drink. Rose lifted his head, cradling it carefully, and pressed the cup to his cracked lips. Most of the liquid ran down his chin, but some went in. She prayed it was enough. Then came the task she had been dreading, setting his leg. Rose had done this exactly once before. A neighbor's son, 12 years old, who had fallen from a tree. It had taken 3 grown men to hold the boy still while she worked. Now she was alone with a man who outweighed that boy by 150 pounds, and there was no one to hold him, and if she did this wrong, she could cripple him for life. "Harder things have been survived," she murmured. She was not sure if she was talking to him, or to herself, or to her mother's ghost. But the words steadied her hands. "Forgive me," she said softly. Then she gripped his ankle and pulled. The bone shifted with a sound she would hear in her nightmares for years. A grinding, crunching sound that was not meant to be heard outside of a body. Jonah's entire frame went rigid. A strangled cry tore from his throat. Rose worked fast, feeling for the break with fingers that knew what they were searching for even when her mind was screaming at her to stop. She found the misalignment, manipulated the pieces until they seated against each other as well as she could manage by touch alone. She splinted the leg with juniper branches, straight ones she selected for their thickness, each as wide as her thumb. She bound them at 3 points with strips of torn cloth, twisting each knot tight, but checking the pulse at his ankle after every binding to make sure she had not cut off the blood flow. Her mother had taught her that. Always check below the splint arose. A limb that cannot bleed is a limb that dies. By the time she finished, tears were running silently down her cheeks, though she barely noticed them. Outside the cave, full dark had fallen. The mountain cold pressed against the entrance like a living thing, and the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the faint taste of snow from the peaks above. Rose fed the fire and settled against the cave wall near Jonah, close enough to hear every breath, every shift, every change in the rhythm that might mean he was slipping away. She should have slept, should have rested while she could. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that boulder, felt the impossible weight of it on her improvised lever, heard the wet crunch of bone, and saw the way Jonah had looked at her in that split second before he lost consciousness. Like he knew her, like he recognized her face. Jonah Calloway, the same last name as the man who was supposed to meet her at the station. A brother, maybe. The station master had mentioned 3 brothers, Silas, Ezra, and young Jonah. Rose pulled the letters from her bag, unfolded them carefully by firelight. Silas Calloway's handwriting was neat, strong, precise. "I won't lie to you," he had written. She looked at the unconscious face of the man on the cave floor, at the blood still seeping through bandages made from her own clothes. "Who are you?" Rose asked the silent cave. "And where is the man who was supposed to meet me?" The fire crackled. "Sawanam Arika crackled." Jonah's breath rattled in his chest, and outside the wind screamed through the canyon like a warning she could not yet understand. She did not know it yet, but the man she had come 2,000 miles to marry was lying right in front of her, and he knew exactly who she was. The first light of dawn arrived thin and gray, creeping into the cave like an uninvited guest. Rose woke with a gasp, her neck stiff from sleeping upright against the stone wall, her shoulders aching from the previous day's labor. For a disorienting moment, she could not remember where she was. Then the smell of smoke and blood brought everything rushing back, and the brief mercy of half-sleep shattered completely. She pushed herself upright. Every muscle protested. The fire had burned to embers during the night, and the cave was cold enough that her breath formed small white clouds in the early light. She coaxed the flames back to life with dry sage and juniper bark, working the kindling gently until the warmth returned. Then she turned to check on Jonah. He was still breathing, shallow but steady. His face was flushed deep red with fever sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. When Rose pressed her palm to his skin, the heat radiating from him made her stomach clench. No, 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 no. Infection. That was the real danger now. Not the broken bones, not the gashes. The invisible enemy that crept into wounds and turned them from painful to fatal. His shoulder wound was the worst. She peeled back the makeshift bandage and saw the telltale angry redness spreading outward from the torn flesh like a dark sunrise. If she did not stop it, it would kill him. Slowly, painfully, certainly. Rose grabbed the tin cup and hurried to the canyon seep. The water trickled out even more slowly in the morning cold, as if the mountain itself were reluctant to help. She waited crouching in the dawn chill, counting the drips, willing them faster, 10 minutes for half a cup. She carried it back like it was liquid gold. While the water heated, Rose went out to search for plants. The early morning canyon was different from the one she had entered the day before. The walls that had seemed menacing in darkness now glowed in shades of rose and amber, the layered stone catching the first angled light like the pages of an ancient book. The air smelled of tea and pine and cold stone and the particular clean emptiness of high mountain mornings. She kept one hand on the canyon wall as she walked, eyes scanning the ground with the knowledge her mother had given her. There, a splash of green between two rocks. She knelt. Wild onion. Good for drawing infection if she could not find enough yarrow. She dug it up carefully, roots and all. 20 minutes of searching yielded a small stand of yarrow, growing in a protected hollow, its feathery leaves and flat white flower clusters unmistakable, plus several pads of prickly pear cactus, the inner flesh of which could be used as a cooling poultice. She carried everything back in her skirt, which she had gathered into a makeshift basket, modesty, a distant concern compared to a man's life. When she re-entered the cave, Jonah's eyes were closed, but they opened at the sound of her footsteps. Glassy, unfocused, bright with fever. You came back, not a question. Closer to disbelief. Did you think I wouldn't blame you if you left? This isn't your problem. Rose set down her harvest and began sorting through it. You are a human being in pain. That makes it my problem. Most people wouldn't see it that way. Then most people are cowards. She felt his gaze on her as she worked crushing the yarrow leaves between two flat stones to release their astringent oils. The silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted. Full of things unsaid. Questions unasked. A tension that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the way this stranger kept looking at her as though he already knew the answer to a question she had not yet thought to ask. Your brother Rose said, finally keeping her eyes on her work. Silas, tell me about the ranch. I need the distraction, and so do you. Another pause, brief but heavy. Big Jonah said. His voice was rough, each word costing him effort. 4,000 acres of grazing land, mostly cattle, some horses. The main house sits on a rise overlooking the valley. My brother built it with his own hands. Started with a one-room cabin, just logs and a dirt floor. Now it is the biggest house in the territory. You can see for miles from the porch, all the way to the snow peaks on clear days. Despite everything, Rose felt a pull of longing. She had grown up in a cramped city house where the only view was the neighbor's washing line. It sounds beautiful. It is. Hard, but beautiful. The mountains do not give you anything you do not earn. His eyes followed her hands as she worked, his expression softening in a way that seemed to surprise even him. You would like it, I think, if you got the chance. He told her about the cattle, how they moved the herds up to the high meadows in summer, where the grass grew thick and green in the mountain snowmelt, then drove them back down to the valley before the first heavy snow sealed the mountain passes. He described mending fence lines by hand, digging post holes in rocky ground, stringing barbed wire in winter cold so bitter it froze to your gloves. He talked about reading weather by the shape of clouds over the peaks and the direction of wind through the pines. When a Chinook comes off the western slope, he said the snow melts so fast you can hear the creeks rise. Rose listened, and as she listened, she worked. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water, applied the yarrow poultice, replaced the blood-soaked bandages with fresh strips cut from her remaining clothes. She fed him water, sip by slow sip. She brewed more willow bark tea and got enough into him to dull the worst of the pain. "Tell me about your mother," he said sometime in the late afternoon when the light in the cave had gone golden and warm. So Rose told him about the herb garden rows of carefully tended plants in a tiny Philadelphia backyard, about the people who came from blocks away when they were sick because Margaret Whitfield could cure what doctors could not, about the way her mother saw the world. Every living thing connected every creature with a purpose. "Every plant has a purpose," Rose said quietly, repeating the words like a prayer. "Every person has a story worth knowing." That is what she believed. She saw the best in everyone, even when they did not deserve it. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. Rose's throat tightened. She died helping someone else, just like she lived. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind pressed against the canyon walls like something trying to get in. "I'm sorry," he said. And something in his voice, something raw and unguarded, made Rose look at him. His expression was open in a way that seemed unfamiliar to his face, as though the fever had burned away whatever walls he normally kept in place. "Thank you," Rose said. They shared the last of her food that evening, a few strips of jerky no bigger than her little finger, 3 crackers each. Rose tried to give him the larger portion, but he refused. "You cannot take care of me if you collapse, Miss Whitfield. Eat, please." Rose's hands went still on the cracker she was breaking in half. She looked at him. "What did you call me?" He blinked. The fever flush on his cheeks deepened, and for one unguarded moment, something that looked very much like panic crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful blankness of a man who has said too much and knows it. "Rose?" he corrected quickly. "I meant Rose. Must be the fever talking." She had never told him her surname. She had introduced herself as Rose, nothing more. He could not have known she was a Whitfield unless someone had told him, unless he already knew. She filed it away, a small thing, a crack in a wall she could not yet see behind. But she filed it away. "Eat," he said again, quieter this time. "Please." Rose chewed slowly, deliberately, making every bite last. The food helped, but it also reminded her stomach how empty it was, how long they might be trapped here, how quickly the line between survival and disaster could blur in this country. That night, the fever climbed higher. Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes rambling about fence lines and cattle and storms and things Rose could not follow. She stayed beside him, feeding the fire, dripping water between his lips, pressing cool cloths to his burning forehead. Near dawn, as the cold pressed closest and the fire burned lowest, his hand found her wrist with sudden and startling strength. His eyes were open, bright with fever, fixed on her face with an intensity that stopped her breath. "Don't hate him." The words came out desperate, almost pleading. "Whatever happens, promise me you won't hate him." "Who?" Rose asked, confused, alarmed. "Who are you talking about?" But Jonah's grip loosened. His eyes went glassy and then closed, and he slipped away again into whatever dark place the fever had built for him. Rose held his hand until the sun rose, painting the canyon walls gold and crimson and promising nothing at all. She did not know who he had been talking about. She did not know why his voice had carried such desperate guilt, as though he were confessing to something terrible while the fever held him past the point of control. But she would know, soon. She would know everything, and nothing would ever be the same. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. Rose woke to find Jonah watching her. His eyes were clear for the first time since the accident. The glazed, distant look was gone, replaced by something sharp and aware and unmistakably guilty. "You are awake," she said, and the relief that poured through her was so strong it made her dizzy. She reached for his forehead, still warm but no longer burning. "The fever is down. Thanks to you." His voice was rough from disuse but stronger than it had been. "How long?" "Almost 3 days. You were delirious most of yesterday. No one has come." It was not a question. "No, not yet. They should have by now." Something shifted behind his eyes. Worry calculation and that guilt again, deeper than before. My brother Ezra knows my route. When I do not show up, he will send riders. And if they do not come, they will come. But his voice lacked certainty, and Rose, who had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly, filed that uncertainty away without comment. She checked his wounds. The yarrow had done its work. The angry redness around his shoulder gash was fading, replaced by healthier pink. The leg splint was holding. He would need a real doctor and soon, but for now he was alive and improving, and that was enough. Rose, he said, and his voice had changed, serious, almost afraid. I need to tell you something. The sound of horses cut him off. Rose froze. For a long moment she thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again, unmistakable. The clip of iron shoes on stone, the creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of men's voices echoing off the canyon walls. Someone is here, she breathed. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the cave entrance. There, picking their way through the narrow canyon, were three riders on big mountain horses. Even from a distance, Rose could see the quality of the animals, the professional ease with which the men sat their saddles. Help, her voice bounced off the canyon walls like a thrown stone. We are here, Help, the lead rider's head snapped up. He shouted something to the others, and they spurred their horses forward, closing the distance in minutes. The first man to dismount was older, mid-50s, weathered and hard-eyed, with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire life giving orders and having them obeyed. Ward Gentry, foreman of the Calloway Ranch. Well, I'll be damned, Ward said, staring at Rose with an expression that was part relief and part something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. You actually found him. The words hit Rose strangely. As if he had been expecting her, as if he knew who she was, though she had never laid eyes on him before this moment. He is hurt, Rose said quickly. Broken leg, cracked ribs, possible internal injuries. He had a fever, but it broke this morning. Where is he? The second rider pushed past her into the cave, and Rose saw him clearly for the first time and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He was tall, enormously tall, broad-shouldered, heavy with muscle, chestnut brown hair cut shorter than Jonah's, amber eyes sharp as a blade, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. And his face, his features, the set of his bones, and the line of his brow were so close to Jonah's face that for one disorienting moment Rose thought she was seeing double. This was a brother, that much was certain. The resemblance was too strong to be anything else. The man looked down at the injured figure on the cave floor, and his expression went through a rapid sequence. Relief first, genuine and intense, then anger, then something hard and cold and furious that turned his amber eyes to flint. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough and carried the weight of a man who had been afraid for 3 days and was converting that fear into rage. Jesus, Silas. What the hell happened? The name struck Rose like a physical blow. Silas, not Jonah, Silas. She turned slowly, looked at the man on the cave floor. The man who had told her his name was Jonah Calloway. The man she had set bones for mixed medicines for, stayed awake 3 nights, for cried over held hands with in the dark. He would not meet her eyes. And in that moment, standing in a shallow cave in a Montana canyon with dust on her dress and blood on her hands, Rosalie Whitfield understood everything. The recognition in his eyes when she first touched him. The way he had called her to Miss Whitfield before she told him her surname. The desperate fever-soaked plea in the middle of the night. Don't hate him. Promise me you won't hate him. He had not been talking about his brother. He had been talking about himself. The man she had come 2,000 miles to marry. The man who had written her letters full of promises about honesty and partnership and building something real. The man who was supposed to meet her at the station and who had never come. He had been here all along, lying beneath her hands, watching her through fever-bright eyes, listening to her share her deepest fears and loneliest truths with a stranger she thought she could trust. And he had lied about everything. Miss, the third rider, was looking at her with concern. You all right, Fine Rose heard herself say. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone far away. I am fine. She was not fine. She was not fine at all. But she stood in that cave entrance with her spine straight and her chin lifted and her hands steady at her sides because that was what Rosalie Whitfield did. That was what her mother had taught her. You do not fall apart in front of strangers. You fall apart later alone when no one can see. And then you get up and you keep going. Because harder things have been survived. The wagon ride to the ranch took 2 hours over mountain roads that had never been meant for wheels. Every rut and rock sent a jolt through the wooden bed, and every jolt drew a tight hiss of breath from Silas Calloway, who lay on the makeshift stretcher with his eyes fixed on Rose and his jaw clamped shut against the pain. Rose sat as far from him as the wagon allowed. She stared at the passing landscape and did not speak, did not look at him, did not acknowledge the weight of his gaze on the side of her face, steady and desperate and full of something she refused to examine. The autumn mountains moved past her like paintings hung in a gallery she had wandered into by accident. Aspens blazing gold and copper against slopes of dark pine. The creek alongside the trail catching the late afternoon light like hammered silver. A red-tailed hawk circling slow and patient above the tree line riding thermals that were invisible from the ground. The air was thinner up here, colder tasting of pine sap and snow yet to fall. Ward Gentry drove the wagon. Ezra Calloway rode alongside, straight-backed on a big sorrel gelding, his amber eyes cutting between Rose and Silas, with the quiet attention of a man who noticed everything and trusted nothing. He had not spoken a word since they left the canyon, and his silence had a texture to it, hard and deliberate like a wall built from riverstone. The ranch hands rode behind. One of them had offered Rose water and a wool blanket. She had taken both without thanks because thanks required words, and words required the kind of energy she no longer possessed. When the ranch came into view, Rose's breath stopped in her chest despite everything. It sat on a rise overlooking a valley so vast and golden that for one disorienting moment she thought she had stepped inside one of Silas Calloway's letters. The main house was built of pine log and quarried stone 2 stories tall, with a wraparound porch whose every plank bore the marks of hand tools. Axe cuts in the posts saw marks in the railings. Each board chosen, cut, fitted, and nailed by hands that knew wood the way a preacher knows scripture. The roof was split pine shakes layered like fish scales weathered to silver gray. A stone chimney rose from the east wall built from creek rock, every stone selected for shape and fit, mortared tight against Montana winters that could kill. Beyond the house, the outbuildings spread in a careful arrangement that spoke of planning and labor accumulated over years. A barn large enough for 20 horses, its walls still fragrant with fresh pine sap. Cattle corrals built from peeled lodgepole, the bark stripped clean and smooth. A bunkhouse for the hired men. A root cellar dug into the hillside. A tool shed with the door standing open and inside rows of implements hanging from iron hooks in precise order. Every structure on this ranch had been built by hand, by 3 pairs of hands working from nothing year after year through blizzard and drought and heartbreak and failure. Rose could see that history in every joint and beam, and something inside her chest ached with a feeling she could not name. The valley itself stretched to the horizon in shades of autumn gold, the grass rippling under a wind that had traveled 100 miles without meeting a fence. A creek wound through the property like a vein of silver. Cattle dotted the far pastures, small, dark shapes against the enormous land. And beyond everything, the mountains rose in a wall of purple and white snow on the peak's timber, on the sloped sky above that went on forever. This was what she had come for. This view, this life, this promise of something built from nothing, earned with sweat and stubbornness, and the kind of bone-deep determination that her own father had possessed but never been able to sustain. Built on a foundation of lies. The wagon pulled up to the main house. People poured out. Ranch hands, a woman in an apron, flour on her capable hands. They surrounded Silas with questions and concern, lifting him onto a proper stretcher, carrying him inside with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to injuries. Rose climbed down from the wagon without assistance. Carpet bag in hand, spine straight, the posture of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Miss Whitfield, is it?" The voice belonged to a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a warm face and the bearing of someone who ran a household the way a general runs a campaign. Mrs. Harriet Dawson, housekeeper cook, and as Rose would come to learn, the conscience of the Calloway Ranch. "I am Mrs. Dawson. Mr. Calloway sent word about you weeks ago. Your room has been ready and waiting." Rose stared at her. My room, of course. Mr. Calloway was very specific about the preparations. "We have all been so excited to meet you." Mrs. Dawson smiled with genuine warmth. "When you did not arrive with the boss, we were terribly worried." The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. The staff knew about her. They had been expecting her, which meant Silas had received her telegram, had known exactly when her train would arrive, had known she would be standing on that platform alone and afraid. And he had chosen not to be there. How thoughtful, Rose said. Her voice sounded flat and strange in her own ears. Mrs. Dawson led her inside, through a front hall of polished pine floors and handmade furniture and windows that let in the last golden light of the day, up a staircase whose banister had been sanded smooth as glass, down a hallway to a door at the end. And this is yours. Rose stepped inside, and for the second time that day, the breath left her body. The room was perfect, not merely comfortable, not merely adequate, perfect in the way that only careful attention and genuine understanding can achieve. A large bed with a quilt stitched by hand in a pattern of prairie wildflowers. A writing desk positioned beside the window, angled to catch the morning light in the full sweep of the valley view. Bookshelves already filled with volumes she recognized and loved. Shakespeare, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, a wardrobe, a washstand with a porcelain basin, curtains of real linen moving gently in the breeze. And on the writing desk, a vase of wild mountain asters, and beside it a stack of letters tied with string. Her letters, the ones she had sent to Silas over 3 months. He had kept every one. Rose stood in the middle of that perfect room and felt something inside her crack straight down the center. Not her anger. Her anger was intact and blazing. What cracked was the small, stubborn hope she had been carrying since the moment she stepped off the train. The hope that maybe she was wrong, that maybe there was a reasonable explanation, that maybe Silas Calloway was the man his letters had promised. He had known her well enough to choose books she loved and fabrics she would have picked herself and flowers that smelled like the meadow behind her mother's house. He had studied her letters the way a miner studies a claim, extracting every detail, every preference, every quiet admission, and had used that knowledge to build a room designed to make her feel seen. And all the while he had been hiding behind his brother's name, watching her from behind a mask of deception to see whether she was worth the risk of being honest. Rose did not open the wardrobe. She did not touch the new dresses hanging inside. She picked up her carpet bag and walked out of the room. She found Silas in the master bedroom 2 doors down. Dr. Amos Hargrove, a gray-haired man with careful hands and the blunt manner of someone who had been practicing frontier medicine for 30 years, was examining his leg. Ezra Calloway stood against the far wall, all arms folded across his broad chest, his amber eyes tracking Rose as she entered with the quiet intensity of a predator observing potential prey. "May I speak with Mr. Calloway alone?" Dr. Hargrove glanced at Ezra. Ezra's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, the middle Calloway brother did not move. He looked at Rose with an expression that communicated several things at once, none of them warm. Then he pushed himself off the wall and walked to the door. He paused beside Rose close enough that she could smell pine sap and leather and horse sweat and said nothing. But his eyes said plenty. "I am watching you. Every move." Then he was gone, and Dr. Hargrove, with him and Rose, was alone with the man who had deceived her. Silas was propped up against pillows, his broken leg elevated, his face drawn with pain and guilt. The beard was gone, shaved by someone with a steadier hand than his. Without it, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the man she had imagined while reading his letters late at night in her attic room in Philadelphia. "Say it," Rose said. Her voice was calm, perfectly controlled. The voice of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff and refusing to look down. "Whatever you are going to say, just say it. I am sorry." "For which part?" "Not meeting me at the station. Lying about your name, letting me pour my heart out to a stranger who was testing me like a horse at auction. All of it." His hands clenched the blanket. His knuckles were white, every bit of it. "There is no excuse." "Then why?" The room was quiet. Outside, someone was unsaddling a horse, the creak of leather and the soft murmur of a man talking to an animal carrying through the open window. "Because I was afraid." Rose waited. "I was there, Rose. At the station, I watched you step off that train." The words hit her like cold water. She had braced herself for many things: excuse, justifications, elaborate explanations about ranch emergencies and broken roads. She had not expected this. "What, I was standing behind the feed store across the street. I watched you get off the train, watched you sit on that bench, Watched you wait for a man who never came out of hiding. And then I watched you pick up your bag and walk into that canyon alone. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rose had ever heard. Louder than the train whistle that had announced her arrival. Louder than the scream he had made when she set his broken leg. Because the betrayal she had felt before the betrayal of being stood up by a stranger was nothing compared to this. He had been there, 20 yards away, watching her sit alone on that bench with her dignity and her desperation and her $3.42. And he had done nothing. You watched me leave, she said. Her voice was shaking now despite everything she did to steady it. And you did nothing. 5 years ago, I married a woman named Vivian Ashford. Silas spoke as though the words were being pulled from him by force, each one costing more than the last. She was beautiful, charming, said all the right things, said she loved the mountains, loved the ranch, loved the wildness of this country. We married 3 months after we met. I gave her everything, access to the accounts, authority over the household, my complete trust. He paused. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. 6 months later, she disappeared, took $15,000 from the ranch account, and vanished with a man named Frank Mercer, who she had introduced to me as her cousin. They were confidence artists, professional swindlers. They had done it before to other men in other territories. I was just the latest fool. The money nearly destroyed us. Took 4 years to rebuild. My brother Ezra and I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. Young Jonah was barely 19 then, but he worked alongside us without a word of complaint. 4 years of eating nothing, spending nothing, pouring every ounce of sweat and strength back into this land. His voice had hardened to something flat and cold like the surface of a frozen pond. But the money was not the worst of it. The worst was knowing I had been so completely wrong about someone, that I had looked at her every day and seen exactly what she wanted me to see, that everything I thought was real had been performance. Every smile, every touch, every word. So you decided to do the same to me, Rose said quietly. Test me without my knowledge. Watch me when I did not know I was being watched. See whether I was kind when there was nothing to gain from kindness. I thought if you did not know who I was, I could see your real character. Whether you were honest, whether you were strong, whether you were the person your letters promised. And what did you learn? Silas met her eyes. And in that moment, stripped of deception and pretense, his face showed something Rose had not expected to see. Not guilt alone, not shame alone, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability that looked painful, as though someone had peeled back armor he had been wearing for 5 years and exposed everything underneath to the open air. That you are braver than anyone I have ever met. That you do not hesitate when someone needs help, even when it costs you everything. That you are honest, even when the truth is ugly. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. That I do not deserve you, but I am selfish enough to want you anyway. The words hung between them, heavy with truth, heavy with damage. I am not, Vivian, Rose said. I know, do you? Because from where I am standing, it feels like you looked at me and saw her ghost. Saw every woman who ever told a man what he wanted to hear and judged me by their sins. You are right, and I cannot take that back. All I can do is tell you the truth now completely and hope it is enough. Rose was quiet for a long time. She looked at the man in the bed, broken, vulnerable, thoroughly ashamed. She wanted to rage at him, wanted to tell him that his fear did not excuse his cruelty, that being hurt before did not give him the right to hurt her. But she also saw something else. She saw a man who had built an empire from nothing and had it stolen, who had trusted completely and been destroyed for it, who had spent 5 years behind walls so thick that even his own brothers could not fully reach him, and who, despite all of that, had sat down and written a letter to a stranger reaching through the darkness for something he was terrified to believe in. I need time, Rose said finally. Time to think. Time to decide if I can forgive this. How much time, I do not know. But I am staying in that room you prepared. I am eating the food Mrs. Dawson brings. And Silas. She let his name sit in the air between them. Do not ever lie to me again about anything, because the next time I walk away, and I do not come back. She paused at the door and looked back at him one final time. A man keeps his word. Can you do that? Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, a flicker of something that might have been hope. I keep my word, he said quietly. From now on. Always. Rose closed the door behind her and walked back to her perfect room. She sat on the edge of the perfect bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and began to unpack. She had come too far to run now. The days that followed settled into a pattern that was cautious, measured, and watched. By everyone. Rose visited Silas twice a day, morning and evening. Their conversations were brief and carefully neutral. The ranch, the weather, the books on her shelf, safe subjects that circled around everything that mattered without touching it. But there was a second wall Rose had to face, and his name was Ezra Calloway. The middle brother was 28 years old, 6'5", shoulders as wide as a barn door, hands the size of shovels, calloused and scarred from years of woodwork and fence repair. He moved through the ranch with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard, because everyone already knew what happened when Ezra Calloway was unhappy. He did not trust Rose, made no effort to hide it. She felt his amber eyes on her back every time she moved through the house, every time she stepped outside, every time she sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Dawson. On the fourth morning, Rose was helping Mrs. Dawson peel potatoes when Ezra appeared in the kitchen doorway. He removed his hat, sat down at the table without a word, poured himself a cup of coffee, and fixed Rose with a stare that would have made a lesser woman look away. Just curious, he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, and utterly without warmth. What kind of woman travels 2,000 miles to marry a man she has never met, Mrs.? Dawson turned from the stove with a warning look. Ezra Calloway, do not you start. It is all right, Mrs. Dawson. Rose met Ezra's eyes without flinching, the kind of woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The same kind of courage it took to build this ranch from nothing, which I believe your brother did, and you helped. More than anyone around here gives you credit for. Ezra set his cup down. The kitchen was silent except for the pop of the stove and the tick of the clock on the shelf. Vivian damn near destroyed us, Ezra said. His voice was flat, controlled, but Rose could hear the old rage running beneath it like a river under ice. Destroyed him. Took me 4 years of 18-hour days to rebuild what she stole. 4 years of my life I will never get back. I am not Vivian. That is exactly what Vivian said. Rose looked straight into those amber eyes, cold and watchful, and full of pain he had never once allowed himself to show. Vivian would have left your brother to die in that canyon. I stayed. The silence stretched. Ezra's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth, not yet, but something like reluctant acknowledgement. Maybe he said. He stood, put on his hat. I will be watching. I would expect nothing less. He left. Mrs. Dawson let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 5 minutes. Do not mind him, dear. His bark is worse than his bite, I know, Rose said, returning to the potatoes. He is not angry at me. He is angry at the last woman who sat at this table and pretended to belong here. The real Jonah Calloway arrived 10 days after Rose. He was 24, leaner than his brothers, but built from the same mountain timber, with an open face and an easy grin, and the kind of restless energy that made it seem like the room he was standing in was too small for him. He had been back east for 6 months studying new cattle breeding techniques, and he rode into the ranch yard on a lathered horse looking like he had not stopped to eat or sleep since hearing the news. Rose was in the kitchen with Mrs. Dawson when the shouting started upstairs. 3 days. The voice was young and credulous, and loud enough to carry through 2 closed doors. You told her you were me. Are you completely out of your mind? Probably, came Silas's quieter reply. Probably 3 days you lay there pretending to be your own brother while this woman saved your life, and the best you can manage is probably. Rose set down her knife and followed the sound upstairs. She found the door to Silas's room standing open. Ezra leaned against the inside wall, arms folded, watching with the expression of a man who had already expressed his opinions and was now content to let someone else do the yelling. The young man standing beside the bed turned as Rose appeared in the doorway. His eyes widened. You are her, the woman from the canyon. I am Rosalie Whitfield, and I am Jonah, the actual Jonah. He shot Silas a look of pure exasperation. I apologize for my brother borrowing my name to run his ridiculous scheme. It is not your fault. No, but I am related to him, which feels like it ought to count for something. Jonah turned back to Silas. My brother is an idiot who let his past make him cruel. What Vivian did was vile, but that does not excuse testing this woman like she was a horse you were thinking about buying. He looked at Rose again and his expression softened. But he is trying now. And I will say this about Silas. He does not try at things he does not believe in. Then Jonah left, pausing beside Ezra on his way out. And you, he said to his middle brother in a lower voice, need to stop glaring at her like she stole the silver. She saved Silas's life. Act like it. Ezra did not respond, but as Rose watched, she saw it, just for a moment, a twitch at the corner of Ezra's mouth, almost a smile. Almost. The weeks turned. Autumn deepened into something colder and sharper, the aspens dropping their gold, the first dusting of snow appearing on the lower ridges. And Rose, who had arrived at the Callaway Ranch as a stranger and an intruder and an object of suspicion, began to make herself indispensable. She started with the ledger books. 3 years of numbers that had been kept by Silas in a hand more suited to fence posts than fine accounting. Rose spent a full week going through them line by line, and what she found made her sit back in her chair and stare out the window for a very long time. The ranch was mortgaged. $8,000 owed to a bank in Helena at 12% interest. One bad winter, one cattle plague, one drop in beef prices, and the Callaway Ranch would belong to a man in a suit who had never set foot on Montana soil. Silas had not mentioned this in his letters. He had written about the biggest operation in the territory, about building something from nothing, about honest work and honest land. All true, but incomplete. The ranch was big and successful and also fragile, held together by sweat and luck, and a debt that pressed down on everything like the weight of the mountain itself. Rose found Silas on the porch that evening, balanced on his crutches for the first time, watching the sunset paint the valley in colors that had no names. Ezra stood nearby, leaning against a post, silent as always. Rose sat down beside Silas and placed the mortgage document on the table between them. Were you planning to tell me? His face changed. Ezra straightened. Yes. Eventually. Eventually. Rose kept her voice level, but her eyes said everything her mouth held back. You promised complete honesty, Silas. This is the opposite. I rebuilt after Vivian, he said, but I took on debt to do it. Borrowed against the land. Ezra and I have been paying it down, but it is slow. He looked at the document the way a man looks at a wound he has been trying to ignore. One bad year and we lose everything, including the ranch our parents died building. Why did you not tell me in the letters? Would you have come? I do not know. But I should have had the choice. That is what honesty means, Silas. Giving someone the full picture and trusting them to decide for themselves. Ezra spoke then, his deep voice carrying across the porch like distant thunder. She is right. Both Rose and Silas looked at him. Ezra met his brother's eyes. I told you from the beginning. Tell her everything. You did not listen. He pushed himself off the post and settled his hat. I am going to check the south fence. He paused, looking at Rose. For what it is worth, Miss Whitfield, the debt is real, but so is the ranch. We are not going under. Not on my watch. He walked away, boots heavy on the porch boards. Rose watched him go and understood something she had not understood before. Ezra Callaway was not her enemy. He was the man who had carried the heaviest load when everything fell apart. The brother who had worked 18-hour days without complaint, while Silas got the credit and Vivian got the money. The quiet center around which the entire ranch turned, and the man who had the most reason of anyone to distrust a woman who showed up uninvited and started asking questions. Rose turned back to Silas. Show me the books, all of them, every penny and every penny out. If I am going to help fix this, I need to see everything. You want to help? I told you I wanted to be useful. And I happen to be very good with numbers. She allowed herself a small smile. My uncle's store never ran a deficit in the 3 years I kept his books. Let me see what I can do. She spent the next week restructuring the ranch finances. Found waste in feed purchasing that it could be eliminated by buying in bulk from a supplier in Helena. Negotiated better terms by letter using skills she had learned watching her Uncle Harold haggle over wholesale prices for 20 years. Reorganized the debt payment schedule to reduce interest burden. When she presented her plan to Silas and Ezra at the kitchen table, spreading the ledger pages out between coffee cups and a plate of Mrs. Dawson's biscuits, both brothers studied the numbers in silence. "This could work," Ezra said. 2 words, the highest praise Rose had ever heard him give. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just between Rose and Ezra, but between Rose and the ranch itself. She was no longer a guest. She was no longer being evaluated. She was becoming, slowly and against all odds, a part of something. Ezra never spoke about this shift directly. That was not his way. But Rose noticed. A bookshelf appeared in her room one morning, built from pine that had been seasoned for 2 years, planed smooth by hand, joined without a single nail. Every surface was sanded to silk. She ran her fingers across the wood and understood. This was how Ezra said, "I accept you," not with words which he distrusted, but with his hands which never lied. Jonah's contribution was different. Loud where Ezra was silent, blunt where Ezra was subtle. He taught Rose to ride, choosing the gentlest mare in the stable, adjusting the stirrups for her short legs, walking beside her for the entire first lesson with a patience that surprised everyone who knew his hot-tempered reputation. When Rose nearly fell dismounting and grabbed his arm for balance, Jonah grinned at her. "You have got more grit than half the men I know," he said, "and you weigh about a third as much. We will make a horsewoman of you yet." 6 weeks after Rose arrived, autumn surrendered to early winter. The first real snow dusted the peaks, and the mornings began with frost on the windows and breath that hung in the air like small white ghosts. Rose went into town with Mrs. Dawson to buy winter supplies: salt, flour, sugar, kerosene for the lamps, dried beans, coffee, the staples that would carry a mountain household through 5 months of snow. They were in the general store when the door opened, and every conversation in the room stopped dead. The woman who entered was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, sharp polish designed for a single purpose. Black hair swept up beneath a fashionable hat, green eyes that swept the room with the lazy confidence of a cat surveying a room full of mice. An expensive silk dress, city clothing, not frontier wear, not even close. Behind her stood a man, mid-30s, fair-haired, cold gray eyes, a suit that cost more than most ranch hands earned in a season. He carried himself with the easy arrogance of someone who had spent his life taking things that did not belong to him. The woman's eyes found Rose and stopped. A slow smile spread across her face, the smile of a predator who has just spotted something interesting. "Well, well, you must be the new Mrs. Calloway. Or should I say the replacement?" Mrs. Dawson stepped forward, her face hard. "Vivian." The name landed in Rose's stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. Vivian Ashford. The woman who had married Silas Calloway, stolen $15,000, and disappeared into the night with the man now standing behind her. The woman whose betrayal had nearly destroyed the ranch and had certainly destroyed Silas's ability to trust. And she was here, in Copper Ridge, standing 10 feet away with a smile that could cut glass. "Mrs. Dawson, how lovely." Vivian's voice was honey poured over broken crockery, sweet on the surface with something jagged underneath. "I have been feeling so nostalgic for Copper Ridge, such a charming little town. What do you want, Vivian?" "Oh, nothing dramatic." Vivian's green eyes traveled over Rose from head to toe. Assessing, dismissing. "I just thought I should come collect what is rightfully mine. You see, dear," she turned to Rose, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial sweetness. "Silas and I were never properly divorced, just separated, which means technically half that ranch still belongs to me." The man behind her, Frank Mercer, spoke for the first time. "We have documents. The separation agreement was never properly filed with the territorial court. Our attorney in Helena has been looking into it. Quite thoroughly." Vivian smiled. "Tell Silas I will be staying at the hotel. We have so much to catch up on." They left. The store was silent. Mrs. Dawson gripped Rose's arm, and Rose realized her own hands were trembling. Back at the ranch, the news hit like a rock slide. Silas went white. His hands closed into fists on the arms of his chair, the knuckles bloodless. Ezra did not move, did not blink. But something ignited behind those amber eyes. A fury so cold and controlled and precise that Rose understood for the first time why people in Copper Ridge stepped aside when Ezra Calloway walked past. Jonah was on his feet immediately, pacing, his voice sharp enough to strike sparks. "I will ride to Helena tonight. Find a lawyer. If she thinks she can waltz back here after 5 years and take what we built with our blood and sweat, she has another thing coming. Sit down, Jonah. Silas's voice was tired. Defeated, she is not wrong. The separation papers. I was so angry, so humiliated, I just wanted her gone. I signed what Frank put in front of me and never checked whether the papers were properly filed. It was stupid. You were hurt, Rose said. Everyone looked at her. You were hurt and angry and you wanted it over. That is human. But right now we need to think clearly. We Ezra's voice. Not hostile this time. Something closer to a challenge. A test, but a different kind than Silas had given her. We. Rose met his eyes without wavering. I may not be a Calloway by name, but I have put my hands in the dirt of this ranch. I have kept its books and tended its people, and I am not going to stand by and watch everything you three built get stolen by a confidence woman and her accomplice. The room was silent. Then Jonah smiled. Wide, warm, genuine. I like her, he said to Silas. I really, really like her. Even Ezra nodded. Once. But it meant everything. 3 days later, Rose was in the storage shed behind the barn searching through old records for documents the lawyer would need. Ezra stood guard at the door. He had taken to doing this without being asked, positioning himself between Rose and the world with the quiet protectiveness of a man who had decided finally and completely whose side he was on. Rose moved crates, shifted boxes, disturbed 5 years of dust and cobwebs. And in the back corner behind a shelf, she found it. A small wooden box, rough cut, pushed into a gap between the wall studs as though someone had hidden it in haste. Inside were letters. Not her letters. Not Silas's letters. They must have belonged to Frank Mercer, who had stayed at the ranch for weeks posing as Vivian's cousin and who had apparently hidden them here rather than risk carrying evidence of his own scheme when they fled. Vivian's letters, written to Frank Mercer, dated before Vivian had ever met Silas Calloway. Rose read the first one by the light of the shed's single window, her hands perfectly still. Dearest Frank, the Calloway Ranch is perfect. Exactly what we have been looking for. The oldest brother is lonely, trusting, desperate for companionship. Everything we need. I estimate 6 months before we can access the accounts. The key is patience. There were more. Half a dozen letters detailing the plan step by step. How to approach Silas. How to build trust. How to access the money. How to disappear. And in the last letter written 2 weeks before Vivian vanished, a single line that changed everything. If things go wrong, we leave the separation papers unfiled. Insurance for later. Rose looked up. Ezra. He crossed the shed in 3 strides, took the letters, read them, and Rose watched his face, that stony, unreadable, iron, disciplined face transform. His jaw clenched until the muscles in his temples jumped. His hands, those enormous carpenter's hands that could shape wood into beauty, closed into fists. This proves it, he said. His voice was barely controlled. Premeditated fraud. She planned the whole thing from the beginning, including not filing the divorce, which means her claim on the ranch is not just morally wrong, it is legally fraudulent. If we can get these letters to a judge. Ezra looked at her. And for the first time since Rose had arrived at the Calloway Ranch, she saw in those amber eyes not suspicion, not caution, not grudging tolerance, but genuine, unqualified respect. You are something else, Rose Whitfield, he said. It was the first time he had called her by name. The confrontation took place 3 days later in the front parlor of the Calloway Ranch House. Arthur Blackwell, an attorney from Helena Gray, haired and meticulous, sat at the head of the table with documents spread before him. Vivian occupied the best chair legs, crossed her smile firmly in place. Frank stood behind her, hands in his vest pockets, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. On the other side of the room, Silas sat in a straight-back chair. His injured leg extended, his face tight with pain and anger. Ezra stood to his right, arms folded, immovable as the mountains outside the window. Jonah stood to his left, coiled and restless, his hands opening and closing at his sides. And Rose stood in the center of the room with a stack of letters in her hands. Vivian spoke first. She told her story beautifully. A difficult marriage, a controlling husband, a woman who had no choice but to flee for her own safety. All she wanted, she said with perfect, wounded dignity, was what was fair. Then Rose stepped forward. "May I, Mr. Blackwell?" The attorney nodded. Rose placed the letters on the table, one at a time, methodical, unhurried, each one positioned with the precision of someone laying out evidence in a court of law. These letters were found in a storage building on this property 3 days ago. They are written in Mrs. Ashford's handwriting, which I have verified against the separation documents she signed 5 years ago. They are addressed to Mr. Frank Mercer, and they are dated before Mrs. Ashford ever met Silas Calloway. Vivian's smile did not waver. Not yet. They describe in specific detail a premeditated plan to defraud Mr. Calloway of his assets, including a direct instruction to leave the separation papers unfiled as, and I quote, insurance for later. The smile died, slowly like a candle flame in a draft. Vivian's green eyes darted to Frank. Frank's face had gone the color of old ash. "These are forgeries," Vivian began. "They are not, and you know it." Rose's voice was calm, level, as steady as the mountains visible through the window behind her. "Mr. Blackwell, I believe these letters constitute evidence of premeditated fraud, a crime under territorial law. If Mrs. Ashford presses her claim, these documents will be submitted to Judge Patterson in Helena, along with testimony regarding similar operations she has conducted in other territories. You do not have proof of other Franks started." "Do I not?" Rose looked at him. She did not have proof, not yet. But the absolute certainty in her voice, the unshakable composure, made Frank hesitate. And that hesitation was everything. "We should discuss this privately." Frank set his hand closing on Vivian's arm. "Indeed you should." Blackwell gathered his papers with the careful efficiency of a man who recognized a case that was over. "I will file the proper divorce documents with the territorial court first thing Monday. And Mrs. Ashford, I would strongly recommend leaving Copper Ridge before those letters reach Judge Patterson. He is not known for his leniency in fraud cases." Vivian stood. The mask was fully gone now. Underneath was something cold, calculating, and dangerous, the real face of a woman who had made her living on deception and was furious at being outplayed. "You think you have won," she said quietly, looking at Rose. "You are just the latest fool, darling. Give it time." Maybe Rose said, "But I am the fool who found your letters, and I am the fool who is staying." Vivian held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she turned, pulled Frank with her, and walked out the door. When the sound of hooves had faded to nothing, the parlor was silent. Then Jonah spoke. That he said his voice filled with something between awe and terror was the most magnificent thing I have ever witnessed. Ezra walked to Rose. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, deliberately, the way a man touches something he has decided to protect. "Welcome to the family," he said. Then he walked out, and Rose understood that she had passed the last test she would ever need to pass in this house. Silas was staring at her from his chair. His expression was beyond surprise, beyond admiration. It was the look of a man who had spent 5 years believing he would never trust another human being and who had just been proven completely and irrevocably wrong. "You just saved our ranch." Rose looked at him, allowed herself for the first time since learning the truth to smile without an edge. Consider it payment for 3 days of cave nursing. 2 weeks later, the town held its autumn harvest dance in the meeting hall. Rose wore the deep green dress Silas had chosen for her the first time she had touched the clothes in the wardrobe. Silas led her through the door on his arm, still limping, still stubborn, still refusing to use the cane Dr. Hargrove had prescribed. All 3 Calloway brothers attended, Silas at Rose's side, Ezra stationed in the corner, amber eyes sweeping the room, guarding without being asked, Jonah dancing with every willing woman in attendance and telling stories that made the whole room laugh. When the fiddle music slowed, Silas drew Rose onto the floor. He moved carefully, favoring his leg, but he moved. His hand found the small of her back warm and steady, and for the first time in weeks, something inside Rose that had been clenched tight finally carefully began to ease. "I love you," Silas said. Simple, clear, without hesitation. Not the idea of you, not the hope of you, exactly as you are. Stubborn and brave and more honest than any person I have ever known. "I love you too," Rose said. And it cost her something to say it, because love after betrayal is not the same as love before it. It is harder, heavier, earned rather than given. But it is also, she was beginning to understand, stronger. I have been fighting it, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous, but it is true. But loving you does not mean I am ready for promises, she added. Not yet. I need more time, as long as you need. Years if that is what it takes. A man keeps his word. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He was warm, solid, smelling of wood smoke and pine and something that was just him familiar now in a way that 3 months of letters and 3 days in a cave and 6 weeks of careful, painful honesty had made as natural as breathing. On a November evening, the first real snow falling soft and silent over the valley, Silas took Rose to the hilltop west of the ranch house. The land spread below them in shades of white and silver, the creek dark against the snow, the mountains enormous against a sky filled with more stars than Rose had seen in her entire Philadelphia life. I am ready, she said. The words surprised her, though they should not have. She had been walking toward them for weeks. To stop being scared. To stop holding back. Silas turned to face her. Ask me, she said. What you were going to ask in that canyon before the rescue came. Ask me now. He reached into his coat and brought out a small box. Inside was a ring, gold band, small sapphire stone, blue as a September sky. How did you know I wrote to your uncle, asked about your mother, what she loved? He told me about the sapphires, her birthstone. Rose touched the ring with one fingertip. The sapphire caught the starlight and held it. Will you marry me, Rosalie Whitfield? Not because you traveled 2,000 miles, not because it is expected or convenient, but because you choose to. Because you want to build something real with 3 stubborn mountain men who come as a package deal. Rose looked at the ring, looked at the man, looked at the valley below, white with snow, waiting for spring, waiting for whatever they would make of it together. Yes, I choose you, all 3 of you. I choose this, I choose us. She took his hand, he pulled her close, and they stood on the hilltop while the snow fell around them, 2 people who had found each other through deception, but had chosen each other through truth. Built this with our own hands, Rose said softly. And Silas, who had spent 5 years behind walls of his own making, who had tested and deceived and nearly lost the best thing that had ever walked into his life, held her tighter. Every bit of it, he said. The days after the proposal were quiet in the way that follows a long storm, when the rain has stopped and the wind has died, and the world seems to be holding its breath, waiting to see what grows from the mud. Rose and Silas sat on the porch each morning before sunrise, drinking coffee from tin cups, watching the fog lift off the valley in slow white ribbons. They did not speak much during these mornings. They did not need to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the careful, guarded silence of 2 people afraid to say the wrong thing. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said everything that mattered and were now content to simply exist in the same space, breathing the same cold mountain air, watching the same sun climb over the same peaks. Rose cooked breakfast for the household for the first time on a Tuesday morning. Eggs from the ranch chickens, bacon from the smokehouse bread she had baked the night before using Mrs. Dawson's sourdough starter. She set the table in the big kitchen while the wood stove popped and ticked, filling the room with warmth that pushed back against the December chill pressing at the windows. Jonah ate 3 helpings. He ate the way he did everything with enthusiasm and volume, talking between bites about a horse he was training and a fence line that needed mending before the heavy snow came. Ezra ate without comment, which was his way. But when the meal was finished and Rose began clearing the plates, Ezra stood, took the dish towel from its hook by the stove, and washed every dish in the kitchen without being asked and without saying a single word. When he was done, he hung the towel back in its place, put on his hat, and walked out to the barn. Mrs. Dawson, standing by the pantry door, caught Rose's eye and smiled. That afternoon, Silas took Rose across the property, not as a visitor being shown a place, but as a partner being shown what was hers. He walked slowly, his legs still stiff, using a cane he had fashioned himself from a branch of mountain ash, and he pointed out things that mattered. The spring that fed the house well clear and cold year-round, emerging from a crack in the granite 50 yards uphill. The south pasture where the grass grew thickest in June and where the cattle fattened fastest. The stand of lodgepole pine on the western ridge that needed thinning before it became a fire risk. The creek crossing where the bank was soft and a horse could founder if the rider was not paying attention. He told her these things the way a man passes knowledge, to someone he expects to be standing beside him for a very long time. Rose listened to every word, filed each detail in the same part of her mind where she kept the names of healing plants and the symptoms of fever in the proper angle for setting a broken bone. Knowledge that could save a life. Knowledge that could build one. Right where I am supposed to be, she said quietly, standing at the top of the rise and looking out over the valley that would be her home for the rest of her days. Silas glanced at her. She had not been talking to him. She had been talking to herself, or maybe to her mother, or maybe to the 23-year-old girl who had stepped off a train into nothing 2 months ago with $3 in her pocket and a heart full of desperate hope. She had found what that girl was looking for. It did not look the way she had expected. It was harder and messier and more complicated than any letter could have described. But it was real, and it was hers. The wedding took place at the ranch on a clear December morning. The sky was the pale, crystalline blue Sulu that only comes in deep winter and at high altitude, the kind of blue that looks like it might shatter if you touched it. Snow lay thick on the peaks, but the valley itself was bathed in clean golden light, the kind of light that made everything it touched look honest. They held the ceremony on the porch. Rose had insisted, not inside behind walls, outside where the mountains could see, where the land they would spend their lives tending could witness the promises being made. Dr. Amos Hargrove performed the service reading from a small, leather-bound volume of poetry that had belonged to Rose's mother. Margaret Whitfield had carried that book across the Atlantic from England as a girl, and it had traveled with Rose from Philadelphia to Montana in the bottom of her carpet bag, and now its words floated out across the frozen valley like seeds looking for soil. Rose wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, cutting and sewing it at Mrs. Dawson's kitchen table over the course of 2 weeks, pricking her fingers on the needle and starting the hem over 3 times until it hung exactly right. It was not the most beautiful dress in the territory. It was not the most fashionable, but every stitch was hers, made by her own hands for a life she had chosen with her own heart. Silas stood at the porch rail in a dark wool suit that Mrs. Dawson had pressed until the creases could have cut paper. His hair was combed, his boots were clean, his hands, those enormous, scarred, calloused hands that had built a ranch from raw timber and sheer will, hung at his sides and trembled. Jonah stood beside his brother. His eyes were wet, though he would deny it later, and in fact did deny it loudly and at length to anyone who asked. He kept clearing his throat and looking at the mountains and claiming something was in his eye. Ezra stood on the other side, silent, solid, his face unreadable to anyone who did not know him. But Rose knew him now, and she saw what was behind that iron expression as clearly as she saw the mountains behind him. When she walked to the porch rail and took her place beside Silas, Ezra met her eyes and nodded. Once, just once. And in that single motion was everything he had never said and never would say. You are worthy. You belong here. Welcome. The vows were simple. Rose had written them herself, and she had written them the way she wrote everything, without ornament and without pretense. I promise to be honest, even when it is hard. I promise to be your partner. Not above you, not below you, beside you. I promise to build something real with these hands. And I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my days. Silas answered in kind. I promise the same. No more tests, no more walls, no more hiding behind names that are not my own. Just us, as we are. Flawed, stubborn, and choosing each other anyway. Mrs. Dawson wept openly into a handkerchief. Ward Gentry stood at the foot of the porch steps with his hat in his hands and his weathered face turned up to the winter sun, and if his eyes glistened, nobody mentioned it. That night they became husband and wife in every sense of the word. When morning came, the first true snows of winter had begun to fall, covering the valley in a silence so deep and so white that the world seemed new. Rose stood at the bedroom window and watched it come down thick and soft and relentless, and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Peace, Amon. Silas came up behind her, put his hand on the small of her back. Warm, steady. Winter always ends, he said. Rose leaned into him. I know. But this one, she thought, looking at the snow and the mountains and the life stretching out ahead of her like an unwritten page, this one I do not want to rush. The first spring came like a resurrection. The snow retreated up the mountains, pulling back like a tide, revealing meadows that erupted in wildflowers so thick and vivid They looked painted. The creek swelled with snowmelt and roared through the property loud enough to hear from the porch, carrying with it the smell of thawing earth and new growth and the promise that the hard months were behind them. Rose planted her herb garden. Not the cramped window box of her Philadelphia days, but a proper garden laid out in careful rows behind the kitchen, surrounded by a fence Silas built from split cedar to keep the deer out. Yarrow, comfrey, willow, echinacea, mint, sage, lavender. Plants her mother had taught her to tend, now growing in Montana soil 2,000 miles from where their seeds had first been pressed into a little girl's palm. Ezra, without being asked, built a chair and placed it at the edge of the garden. Pine seasoned, 2 years, plain smooth, joined without nails. The kind of chair a person could sit in for hours watching things grow. He did not mention it. He did not wait for thanks. He simply built it and left it there, and one morning Rose found it and sat down in it and ran her hands along the armrests and understood. "Built this with our own hands," she said to the empty garden, and she smiled. Their son was born in the winter of 1880 during a blizzard that closed the mountain passes and buried the ranch in 3 feet of snow. Silas paced the porch for 9 hours, back and forth, his boots wearing a track in the snow that covered the floorboards. Inside, Mrs. Dawson and Dr. Hargrove tended to Rose, and the sounds that came through the closed door were the kinds of sounds that turned strong men pale. Ezra sat on the stairs. He did not pace. He did not speak. He held a piece of pine in his hands and a small knife, and he carved. Slowly, methodically, with the patient precision that defined everything he did. His hands were steady. His face was not. When the baby's cry broke through the closed door, sharp and thin and furious, Silas stopped moving. Just stopped. Stood at the top of the porch steps with snow in his hair and his heart somewhere in the vicinity of his throat, and he did not move again until Mrs. Dawson opened the door and said, "Come meet your son." Silas crossed the room to where Rose lay exhausted and radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in the quilt from their bed. She pulled back the cloth and showed him a face no bigger than his palm. Red, wrinkled, with a thatch of dark hair and fists curled tight as pine knots, and a jaw that even at 10 minutes old looked stubborn. "A boy," Rose said. She was tired beyond description, but she was smiling. "I was thinking Edmund. After my father." Silas reached out, his hands the hands that had swung an axe and strung wire and built a house from the ground up. The hands that had never trembled through any of it shook as he took his son. He held the baby against his chest, and the child was so small against the breadth of him that it looked like he was holding a loaf of bread. And Silas Calloway, who had not cried since his mother's funeral, who had not cried when his wife robbed him, who had not cried when a boulder crushed him in a canyon, pressed his face against his son's head and wept. Jonah came in from the barn where he had been pretending to check on the horses and not at all pacing and worrying. He looked at the baby and grinned. "He has got your stubbornness already. Look at that jaw." Everyone laughed, even Ezra. And later, when Rose was sleeping and the baby was sleeping and the fire was burning low, she found the thing Ezra had been carving on the stairs. A horse. Tiny, perfect, smooth as water. He had placed it on the table beside the cradle without a word. The years that followed were the kind of years that build a life the way a river builds a canyon, slowly and with great force, one season at a time. The railroad survey came through the valley in 1882, and land values tripled overnight. Men came from Helena and Butte and as far away as Chicago offering to buy. Silas refused them all. He was not building to sell. He was building to last. They expanded, bought adjacent parcels when smaller homesteaders gave up and moved on, added cattle, built a new barn larger than the first with Ezra designing the frame and supervising the construction, every joint fitted so tight you could not slide a piece of paper between the timbers. Jonah took charge of the horse operation, and his eye for good stock became legendary in the territory. Ranchers came from 3 counties away to buy Callaway horses because a Callaway horse was a horse you could trust with your life. Rose managed the money, every penny in, every penny out, recorded in her neat, careful hand in ledger books that she kept locked in the study desk. She negotiated feed contracts with suppliers in Helena, using skills she had learned watching her Uncle Harold haggle over wholesale prices. She renegotiated the bank loan at a lower rate. She trimmed waste-found efficiencies, stretched every dollar until it begged for mercy. 4 years after Rose arrived, she burned the mortgage document in the fireplace. The three Calloway brothers stood in the parlor and watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Ezra put his hand on Rose's shoulder. It was only the second time he had ever touched her voluntarily, and it was the second time he had ever called her by her first name. "Thank you, Rose." 3 words. From Ezra Calloway. 3 words were an aria. Their daughter arrived in 1883. They named her Margaret after Rose's mother. She had her mother's honey blonde hair and cornflower blue eyes and her mother's delicate build, but her temperament was pure Jonah Calloway. Stubborn, loud, fearless, and born with an opinion about everything. By the time she was 3, the ranch hands had learned to stay out of her way when she was in a mood, and Jonah claimed her as his own so often that visitors sometimes believed him. The community came around the way communities do when stubbornness is eventually overwhelmed by evidence. In 1884, when the Calloways held a barn raising for their new equipment shed, 20 families showed up. Rose cooked for all of them, working alongside Mrs. Dawson from before dawn until after dark, feeding waves of hungry workers who came in from the construction, smelling of sawdust and sweat. Mrs. Pemberton, the boarding house owner, who had refused to take Rose in on her first night in Copper Ridge, arrived with a pot of soup she had made herself. She stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the pot like a peace offering, and said the words that Rose had waited 4 years to hear. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Calloway." Rose took the pot, set it on the counter, looked at the woman who had turned her away when she had nowhere else to go. "You are not the first," Rose said, "and you will not be the last." Then she smiled, and Mrs. Pemberton smiled, and that was the end of it. The winter of 1886 nearly broke them. It came early and stayed late, and was crueler than anything the territory had seen in living memory. Temperatures dropped so far below zero that the mercury retreated to the bottom of the thermometer and stayed there. Snow fell for 11 days straight. The creek froze solid. Cattle that could not reach shelter died where they stood, their bodies found weeks later when the drifts receded, frozen stiff in attitudes of walking, as though they had simply stopped mid-stride and turned to ice. The Calloway Ranch lost 200 head, 200 animals that represented years of breeding, months of feeding, countless miles of riding and roping and tending. Silas stood in the south pasture on a February morning, knee-deep in snow, looking at the dead cattle scattered across the white field like dark stones, and Rose watched from the porch and thought this would be the thing that finally broke him. She was wrong. Silas looked at the loss, absorbed it, let it settle into his bones the way cold settles into fence posts. Then he turned, walked back to the house, stamped the snow from his boots, and looked at Rose. "Winter always ends," he said. And those 3 words which Rose had first whispered to a dying man in a canyon cave, which she had heard repeated in moments of doubt and exhaustion and fear throughout the years, landed differently now. They landed with the weight of everything that had come before. Every season survived, every setback overcome. Every morning they had woken up and chosen to try again. "Harder things have been survived," Rose answered, "and they rebuilt. Again, the way they always did." Ezra married in 1887. It surprised everyone except Rose, who had noticed the way the quietest Calloway brother had started finding excuses to visit Helena with unusual frequency. Her name was Clara Whitmore, widow with steady hands and level eyes, and the kind of practical intelligence that made Ezra look almost chatty by comparison. They met at a cattle auction, spoke 7 sentences to each other. Ezra came home and told Silas he was getting married. "You have known her 3 hours," Silas said. "Long enough," said Ezra. The wedding was held at the ranch. Clara wore a simple blue dress and looked at Ezra as though she had been searching for him her entire life and had finally found the precise place where all the missing pieces fit. Jonah married 2 years later in 1889, and of course his wedding was the loudest event in the history of Copper Ridge. He married Sarah Aldridge, the new school teacher, a woman with red hair and a temper that matched his own, and a laugh that could be heard from one end of the valley to the other. Their fights were legendary, their reconciliations were louder, and their love was the kind that burned hot and bright and never once flickered. The Calloway Ranch grew. 3 houses now stood on the rise overlooking the valley. Silas and Rose in the main house. Ezra and Clara in the house Ezra built himself 50 yards east, every board planed and fitted with the precision of a master carpenter. Jonah and Sarah in a place Jonah insisted on building in record time, which resulted in a roof that leaked every spring until Ezra quietly fixed it without being asked. Children filled the property. Edmund grew tall and quiet like his father, with his mother's gift for numbers and his grandmother Margaret's instinct for healing. Young Margaret grew wild and bright like Jonah riding before she could properly walk, arguing with the ranch hands before she lost her baby teeth. Ezra's children were measured and careful. Jonah's boys were loud and reckless and loyal to the bone. The years turned, one baby after another, the way they do. 30 years is a long time, long enough to build an empire from nothing, long enough to raise children and bury friends and watch the world change in ways you never expected, long enough to forget what it felt like to be young and afraid and alone, and long enough to remember it all over again every time you looked at the mountains and thought about how far you had come. In the autumn of 1908, Silas Calloway was 62 years old. His hair was silver at the temples. His back was not as straight as it had once been, though he was still tall, still broad, still moved through the world with the deliberate confidence of a man who had built something that would outlast him. His right leg had never fully healed. The injury from the canyon 30 years ago had left him with a limp that worsened in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the rock slide and the woman who had refused to leave him under it. Rose was 53. There were lines around her eyes and silver threads in her honey-colored hair, but her blue eyes were as sharp and clear as they had been the day she stepped off the train, and she still walked through the ranch with the purposeful stride of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged and exactly what needed doing. The ranch was 10,000 acres now. Edmund, 28, managed the northern range. Margaret, 25, had married a surveyor from Missoula and visited every month, bringing with her a small daughter with her grandmother's blonde hair and her great-grandmother's stubborn chin. 4 grandchildren in total chased each other across the property, their laughter echoing off mountains that had heard 3 decades of Calloway voices and had, it seemed, grown accustomed to the sound. Ezra, at 58, was still the quietest man in Montana, still built furniture in his workshop behind the house. The main house was filled with his work, every piece perfect, every joint invisible, every surface sanded to silk. Tables and chairs and bookshelves and a cradle that had held every Calloway baby born in 30 years, including 3 of his own. Clara, his wife, was the only person alive who could make him laugh out loud, and she did it at least once a day, which she considered her greatest accomplishment. Jonah, at 54, was still the loudest, still told the best stories around a campfire, still argued with his wife Sarah at volumes that worried the livestock. His 3 sons were built like their father, tall and broad and impossible to ignore, and they rode like they had been born on horseback, which in Jonah's telling, they practically had been. And Rose and Silas, after 30 years, still sat on the porch every morning before dawn and drank coffee together and watched the fog lift off the valley. He still put his hand on the small of her back when he passed her in the kitchen. She still cut his hair on the first Sunday of every month, sitting him down in a chair on the porch and trimming carefully around his ears while he complained that she was taking too long, and she told him to sit still and stop being difficult. They still argued about the ranch, about the grandchildren, about how much firewood they needed for winter, about whether Jonah's boys were old enough to handle the north fence line alone. They argued the way 2 people argue who have spent 30 years learning exactly how to push each other's buttons and exactly how far is too far. They never went to bed angry, not once in 30 years. It was a rule Rose had made on their wedding night, and Silas had kept it because a man keeps his word. Every night before they slept, Silas said the same thing. He had said it every night for 30 years, and he would say it every night for however many years remained. "You are home now, Rose." And Rose answered the way she always answered, the way she had answered 10,000 times and would answer 10,000 more. "I know, right where I am supposed to be." On an October afternoon in 1908, the aspens on the mountain slopes blazed gold again, the same gold they had worn the day Rose first arrived in Copper Ridge. The air smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke and the particular sharp sweetness of autumn in high country. The sky was enormous and blue and streaked with clouds so white they looked like they had been painted there by a hand more skilled than any human's. Rose and Silas sat on the porch. The porch he had built with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail 30 years ago. The porch where they had been married. The porch where they had rocked babies and argued about cattle prices and watched sunsets so beautiful they made your chest hurt. Below them on the wide lawn that Rose had planted and tended and defended against drought and deer and grandchildren for 3 decades, two of Jonah's boys were chasing Margaret's daughter through the wildflowers. Their laughter rose up the hill like music. "Do you remember," Rose said, "when I found you in that canyon bleeding, broken, lying about your name?" Silas laughed. The deep, warm, familiar sound that 30 years of marriage had worn smooth as riverstone. "I remember thinking, even half dead, that you were the most stubborn woman I had ever met. I was the most stubborn woman you had ever met. Still am. Would not have it any other way." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her hand was small in his the way it had always been, but now both their hands bore the marks of 3 decades of shared labor, calluses and scars, and the fine lines that come from building a life by hand together in hard country. "I made a lot of mistakes, Rose." "You did. But I got one thing right. What is that writing that letter?" Rose leaned her head against his shoulder. His shoulder was still broad, still solid, though it moved a little slower now and ached when the weather turned. "No, you got 2 things right. What is the second? Being too stubborn to let me leave." The wind moved through the valley. The aspens trembled gold. The grandchildren laughed. "I love you, Rose Calloway. I know. You have told me every day for 30 years, and I will tell you every day for 30 more. A man keeps his word." Rose closed her eyes, listened to the wind and the laughter and the steady beat of the heart beside her, the heart she had kept alive in a cave 30 years ago, with yarrow and willow bark and the sheer refusal to let go. She thought about her mother, about a kitchen in Philadelphia that smelled of dried lavender and chamomile, about a woman who had placed seeds in a small girl's hands and said, "Every plant has a purpose, Rose. Every person has a story worth knowing." "Mama," she whispered to the autumn air, "I did not let it go to waste." Later that evening, after the grandchildren had been fed, and Jonah had told 3 stories, and Ezra had sat in his corner and smiled his rare smile, and Clara had made him laugh, and Sarah had argued with Jonah about something that nobody could later remember after the dishes were washed, and the fire was banked, and the house was settling into its evening sounds of cooling wood and ticking clocks. Rose stood alone on the porch. The stars were out. More stars than she had ever seen in Philadelphia scattered across the Montana sky like salt on black velvet. The same stars she had seen from a canyon cave 30 years ago, holding a stranger's hand in the dark, wondering if she had just made the worst decision of her life. She remembered. All of it. Stepping off the train into nothing. The empty platform. The cold wind sweeping dead leaves across weathered boards. $3.42 in her reticule. A mother's cameo brooch already sold. A packet of dried herbs in the bottom of a carpet bag, and a desperate, stubborn, foolish hope that somewhere on the other side of those mountains there was a place where she could matter. She had found it. Not the way she expected, not easily, not cleanly, not without pain and betrayal and anger and the so difficult work of learning to trust a man who had earned her trust through action, not words. Through years of keeping his promises. Through years of choosing honesty even when it cost him. Through years of standing beside her steady and stubborn and imperfect and hers. She still remembered stepping off that train into nothing. 30 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers, she thought, that was the day my real life began. From inside the house, Silas's voice carried through the open door. "Rose, coffee is ready." She smiled, turned away from the stars. Walked back into the warm light of the house, into the smell of coffee and pine wood, and the sound of Jonah's laughter from somewhere down the hall, into the life she had built with her own hands alongside 3 stubborn mountain men in the high country of Montana Territory. "This mountain chose you," Mrs. Dawson had said on the day Rose arrived, and the mountain, it seemed, had chosen well. She was home, finally, truly, completely home. If this story stayed with you, hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And which part hit you the hardest? I always love hearing from you.